Okay, record. Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and we're welcome to our discussion here on how do we build a more empathic culture and society. And I'm here today with Ike Lasater. Thanks for joining me for this discussion, Ike.
Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So let's just start with a little bit of an introduction of who you are. You're co-founder of Mediate Your Life, which is a training company that it says on the bio here helps build better lives by changing how they respond to conflict. And you're also a lawyer, a mediator, a trainer, and you're working with organizations and individuals, and you've been on the board of the Nonviolent Communication, Center for Nonviolent Communication. And what else would you like to say about, by way of introduction? Oh, let me mention, you're an author of a lot of books. It's amazing. I mean, so I got one of them here, which is Choose Peace, New Ways to Communicate to Reduce Stress, Create Connection, Resolve Conflicts. That's one of them. It's part of a series. And the second one, I think in the series, was From Conflict to Connection, Transforming Difficult Conversations into Peaceful Resolutions. And the third one was When Your Mind Sabotages Your Dreams, Turning Your Critical Voices into Collaborative Allies. And I think there's a couple more as well.
Yeah.
So
we have the second edition of Words That Work in Business coming out with Puddle Dancer Press in the spring, and also a small kind of practice manual that'll be about 50 pages that'll be published by Puddle Dancer in the spring called Collaborating in the Workplace. And then there's a manual, the 5th edition of a manual that John Kenyon and I use to teach all over the world, really. Now, for me, in over 21 countries. And then another book that I put a chapter in, which was written by my former wife, Judith Lasater. And the people in the yoga world tend to like that book a lot. I get lots of positive feedback about that book.
yeah, and when I first started in the work on empathy, I also took one of your workshops that you and I held. It was, I think, a 3-day workshop, and there was a big, thick manual that came with that, too. So you've been doing a lot of training, you've been writing books, and it's been kind of the foundation has been nonviolent communication.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk a little bit about like how you came to nonviolent communication and what got you interested? So you were like a lawyer to begin with, and
right.
Some sort of a transformation.
Yes, some sort of transformation. So I was living in San Francisco. I was married and had 3 younger children. I had a law firm with a partner. We ended up having a firm of about 20 people. We handled ever larger cases that were characterized by being lots of documents. The last case I did had over 800 boxes of documents that were delivered and reviewed, and for more and more money at risk, and tended to have multi-parties. So the more parties you add to a lawsuit, the more complexity. I did that for about 20 years. And during that period of time, there's a certain pattern to lawsuits, and they tend to become initiated. They get initiated, and then you can't talk to anyone about settlement. And you can try. I tried repeatedly, but it wasn't until you got closer to trial that anybody was ready to go through the process of actually trying to settle the case. And that frustrated me. So that was one thing. Second thing is that, I thought trying lawsuits was going to be hard, but having a law firm was even harder, being a manager, being an owner, and having to make, deal with personnel decisions and choices. And that was very often painful and took up a lot of my partners and my time. And I was looking for something, and I was looking for consultants, and I was looking for help. I didn't know what. And I went to a Zen meditation retreat, which was a regular part of my life at that time. And the teacher is a friend, and he mentioned this communication, something about communication, and it had 4 components: observation, feeling, needs, request. And I'd been sort of laying in the sun on the grass, and I heard that, and I sat up and I said, you know, tell me more about that. And he made a joke and said, well, welcome to joining us, Ike. So I got the information from him. It sat around in my to-do list for months, and then I finally made a telephone call, and it's when Marshall was at his office in northern Texas. And then months later, I got literally a mimeographed flyer. This was in the days way past when you had better ways. And I had stacks of glossy trainings that lawyers are inundated with trying to get them to go to trainings. And then here comes this mimeographed sheet, and it attracted my attention, and I signed up for it and then forgot about it. And then it was a Friday, and I showed up, and I went in, and Marshall was not a very tall guy. He was about 5'8", and he'd have these prominent eyebrows and ridge lines, and he was messing with a guitar. And I said, and it was in an adult mental health daycare center. So, sort of had to go through this Kafkaesque world to get to the library. And I just said, in my mind, what in the world am I doing here? This is crazy. And, but the workshop started, and Marshall just started doing his thing. And literally within 30 to 45 minutes, I remember saying to myself, I don't know what this is. I don't know how to do this. And it looks like magic to me, but I'm gonna learn how to do this. I was all in after the first 30 or 40. Marshall was coming to the Bay Area at that time twice a year. And I just started going to everything he did. And then about 4 years or 5 years later, the Bay NVC was started, and I helped them. I volunteered for a series to put things on. And so during this period, I decided to stop practicing law. I was sort of disabled because of the stress. And it took me about 2.5 years to dig myself out of that hole. But I quit practicing law. And meanwhile, Marshall had asked me to be on the board for the Center for Nonviolent Communication. The board meetings were held at different places around the world. And I started to go to those 3 times a year. I was on the board for 6 years. And they tended to coincide with Marshall doing work in different areas. So I went to a lot of Marshall workshops in cultures very different from US culture, Brazil, Hungary. And he was set up to go to, and many others that I haven't named. He was set up to go to Pakistan. And I sent him an email and asked if I could tag along, and he said, fine, as long as you make your own plans. And John Kenyon, it turned out, had done the same thing. He lived in the Bay Area. I lived in the Bay Area at the time. And we were in a board meeting, John and I and Marshall and a whole bunch of other people in Budapest, Hungary. And I left 2 days early because I had real problems with jet lag. And I got there to a notice slipped under the door of my hotel saying that the American State Department was asking all Americans to leave and leave Pakistan because there had been the kidnapping of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal. And we found out a little bit later that he'd been beheaded, but they didn't know that at this time. And so John was already on the way, and so we joined up and we connected up with the folks that had invited Marshall, and Marshall sent an email and said, no, I'm not going to come. It's too dangerous. Or he didn't say too dangerous. He just said, I don't feel comfortable, and I would like you to leave. John and I hung around and talked for 2 or 3 days with the folks that had set up the invitation for Marshall, and we started feeling okay. So we called Marshall again and said, look, we have all of this set up. We have a driver, a translator, and so on. We're going to go to Peshawar. Would you like to come with us? He said, no. And I said, well, what would you like us to do, Marshall? And he said, I want you to leave now. And this is all in the context of his having lost colleagues, particularly in Africa at various times. But for whatever reason, John Kenyon and I decided to go on, and we went, and we ended up spending 3 days with the elders of an Afghan refugee camp, very close to the Khyber Pass, which is not very far from Kabul, and this outside of Peshawar. And I think that it changed John and myself more than it changed anybody else. John ended up leading a mediation between, on the 3rd day, we had figured out the logistics for the day and the time, and they wanted to end at a certain time in order to go to the mosque and pray. And then the next thing, after we'd figured that out, then the next thing, somebody invited us to go to the mosque and pray with them. And then the next person that spoke said, no, they can't go to the mosque. They're not Muslim. And John turned to me and whispered, we've found our dispute. And what he meant by that is that for 2 days, we'd been asking them if they had any disputes so that we could do a role play and demonstrate what we were talking about, because otherwise we were just talking concepts. The translation was very poor, going both directions. And I said, in my mind, I said, in a profane way, people get killed for stuff like that around here. But we did start that, and it was very successful. There are all sorts of ins and outs of it, but the result of it is that we came up with a resolution that was sort of convoluted, but included us having a tour of the mosque and then sitting outside of the mosque during prayer. And that was the essence of it. And John turned to the room and said, so do we have an agreement that everybody's satisfied with? And the room was pin drop silent for it seemed like a long time. And then it just erupted in all of this kind of joyous murmuring. We left, not very long after that, after we'd said goodbye to everybody twice. We'd gone around the circle twice. And the person who was identified as a senior elder in this camp said, if we knew how to do this, we would not need war. So we left, and that had a very strong impact.
Oh, sorry. Maybe I could just reflect what I'm getting so far. So what I understand is that you, you worked as a lawyer, had your own firm, and that you're just starting to feel dissatisfied with the type of work that you were doing, as well as just
distressed with how conflict was dealt with.
Oh, So just having a lot of
in the law firm, there'd be a conflict, and then those two people wouldn't talk with each other, but they would talk with other people in the firm, and it would just kind of get everybody all riled up, and we didn't have a way of dealing with it.
So you didn't have good ways, it was not good ways of dealing with conflict, and as well as just dealing with the management of the whole operation, because it's a lot of responsibility, you're starting to feel stressed out. And then you learned about Marshall Rosenberg's work with nonviolent communication, and you're just kind of taken with that as a way of resolving conflict. And then you started working with him for quite a while, and then that led you to Pakistan to actually do a mediation there with the community, and just seeing the real deep power of this work with nonviolent communication. Would you say that that's what is the role of empathy? Because what I'm looking at, what you're talking about there is like a culture of empathy, right? That is, in my terminology, is that you had a conflict with the group there in Pakistan, and you were able to mediate that, and everyone was able to sort of empathize with each other, feel heard, and then they say at the end, well, if we had these skills, we would, or this way of being, we wouldn't be having these wars and these fights and so forth. Yeah. So I guess I'm looking at the empathy aspect of it.
Well, since then, or during that time and since, I've done a lot of reading, various people talking about conflict and what is it, how do you go about dealing with it. And, there's a great body of literature, which I've just scratched the surface, but nonetheless done a lot of reading in that area. So my experience of NVC it came out of this legal background, but also a number of years of doing regular silent meditation retreats and meditation retreats. So by this time, I had a fair amount of experience of observing my thoughts, my thinking, which most people don't have that skill until they do it. I've even had people say, oh, I don't have thoughts. So I initially found NVC to be transformative because it gave me a way to talk to myself. It gave me a way to structure my conversations with myself that produced much better outcomes, because most of my thinking was judgmental, blame, shame, guilt. Who is to blame was the analysis that I would go through over and over again as a lawyer. So I would call that, given your question, I would call that a meditative process of self-empathy. I did a lot of self-empathy, and it was transformative for me. And that's, I believe, the foundation for a culture of empathy. Is one, can I identify my own needs? Can I first identify my internal experience, that I'm having an internal experience, that I'm feeling what I'm feeling where I'm feeling. A lot of people need to have training to experience that. So can I experience my experience, and then can I identify the need? Because I believe that by connecting with, because identify is not quite the right word, connecting with is not quite the right word for me. But Robert,
perhaps sense.
Robert Gonzalez talks about savoring, and that's also, and sense is a possibility. It's an internal conversation in which, using Zen language, I float the koan, just a thought through my mind of, given that I'm experiencing this, feeling this, that this is my observation, maybe I even know what my request is. What need am I needing? And I think this is a conversation with a nonverbal part of ourselves that has access to consciousness, the nonverbal part, but it is not, it's not readily available to the conscious mind to have this conversation. But if you ask this question of what need, and you ask it in the form of, is it safety? Is it predictability? Is it order? And you give the nonverbal part something to react to, then it will give you a physiological response It's one metaphor I have is it's like a Tetris block dropping into place, and it's satisfying. Now, in all these workshops that I've done, different people have different explanations of what their internal experience when they get this, I call it a message, a communication from the nonverbal that says, yes, it's that need. And often there is a physiological change to the body when a person identifies what they're needing. So that's what I'm calling self-empathy. I lost the audio.
Sorry, there we go. Just had it turned off. So it's, yeah, so there's this quality of self-empathy. So if I'm feeling sort of a pain inside, so I can feel a little bit of a pain, you know, in myself.
Yeah.
An ache, sort of an ache. And I'm sensitive, oh, that there's an ache there. I can say, oh, that's stupid, that's horrible. It's sort of a judgment, kind of trying to shut it down.
Yeah, you shouldn't feel that way. Life is going well for you. Don't be
people have it worse. You know?
Yes, people have it worse.
So, and then I can kind of shut it down, kind of move, you know, push myself forward. Or I can say, you know, what I can say, okay, I can sense it, I feel it, and be with it. And so that's the self-empathy, sensing into, or as you were saying, the savoring, the sensing of it, and asking what is the, you're calling it need. I've been trying to shift from needs to what feelings do I desire, in a sense, to keep it into the feeling sense. So I'm sort of desiring like a hug quality, a sense of connection, a sense of warmth. For example, that's what kind of comes up in me in the moment.
Yeah, I don't put much emphasis on the feelings. The feelings to me are a doorway to find the need. And it's essential for me to find the need and to feel this physiological shift to confirm that it's the need that I'm looking for, because then that's the doorway to changing your life.
Mm-hmm.
Because then the next question is what could I do? What can I do, or how can I meet my need better in the future? And I don't have to have an immediate answer to that, because I can plant that in my unconscious and it will work on it, and then it will identify the possibilities when they arise, and they'll go, oh, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this.
So when you identify, what I'm getting here is that if I'm feeling sort of this ache, this sort of pain ache, and identify what it is that I'm needing is, I need like a sense of connection. There's a sense of a physical sensation of sort of, you call it a clunk or something.
A validation.
Validation. Yeah, it's like, oh, this is accurate. This is
what I want. This is what I need, or this is what is animating me, is another phrase that I've come up with to try to talk about needs to an audience that doesn't know.
But there's a quality of, once you identify the need, that there's some kind of a shift that happens. And how to kind of identify that shift too. There's a feeling of a shift that happens, that something is sort of integrated, right? And then from there, once you know that, there's a forward motion in terms of how to get that sense of connection, in my sense, sort of addressed.
For me, it naturally arises out of it, but I like the way Robert Gonzalez talks about it. Is once this need, I don't know how he describes the identification, but once there is a clarity, a validation that this is the need that I'm longing to be met right now. It might be a need either that's been met and I'm celebrating, or it could be a need that's not met and I'm mourning. But in either case, I'm down just to the need. This is the need that I long to have met. And I want to stay with that. I want to experience that. I want to savor that, to use Robert's term. And then it then shifts. You said forward motion, but there's a kind of, yes, and how can I have this need met more? And it's critical that the question is either how or what would it take for me to have more, and not why. When we ask why is this need not met, we tend to go down we tend to go down in a spiral towards depression, because the mind generally answers why questions with something about how you're defective, because we all have these core beliefs about how we're not good enough and we're defective and so on. And the mind will supply a why answer. So I want to ask how, and I want to ask what. Preferably how. How can I get more of this? How can I have this need met more? And then,
sorry, go ahead.
Sometimes ideas immediately come to mind. Oh, I could reach out and connect with this person. Oh, I could do this. Those are all strategies to meet the need.
Okay.
And then sometimes I just plant it in my mind, and the thought arises, within hours or days.
Well, I can say from my own experience, I was actually describing a feeling within myself, sort of a yearning for, there's a sort of a pain in sort of the chest area here. And yeah. I was wondering what it was, what the need was, and it was a sense of connection. And the connection for me actually happened by sharing what it was that I was experiencing. So just by sharing it with you, I felt more sense of connection, which kind of felt a little bit more opening to me. The thing is, I do want to kind of address, talk about something about the need. Like I know with nonviolent communication, need is a big component, of it. The word need. Some people use the word values. And I've been looking at the need being a feeling that we desire. There's a feeling, like that feeling of connection, that the need is actually a feeling as well. Like we know the feeling of connection, and there's a quality of warmth. And so if I'm feeling kind of disconnected, a yearning, kind of a pain, I'm yearning for what you're calling a need would be, it's a feeling as well. The need is a feeling, like that feeling of connection has a visceral quality to it.
Yeah.
So
if you have a need met, then it will generate a kind of feeling. And so to that extent, I could understand you saying that. I would be concerned in trying to communicate it to other people that it would cause confusion. We still need to have something that we're pointing to, which is all that words are, is like the need is pointing to something. And as I've said, I think it's this nonverbal part of ourselves that is analyzing the world around us, and safety and predictability and order and sex and food and a range of other needs. But basically the evolutionary psychologists, the evolutionary biologists talk about sex, procreation and food and safety. And so you move towards sex and procreation, you move towards food, and you move away from danger as just a kind of fundamental biological motivations within us. So then we have some kind of name, because now we have this list of needs. So starting with air, water, shelter, warmth, in some cases cool, but we can just put that under shelter. And then these kind of needs that are sort of in the sort of middle, those you need to have to survive, but you also need touch to survive, or at least to thrive. And then you start climbing up through the needs. You need to have, predictability, order, safety, care, love, intimacy, sexual expression, and so on. So we need to have some way of talking about those things. And if you,
so let me just reflect back what I'm hearing. So what you're saying is, what I'm understanding is that there's these qualities which you were laying out, and we need a word to describe what they are. We need some kind of a term to be able to describe the drive for procreation, the drive for air, the drive for safety, and these different drives. That there's the word need is a way of sort of giving a way to a handle, I guess, on those qualities.
I think that it's important to have something to point to, and again, that's what language does. It is not the need of safety is not the need. To call it a need and to call it safety, it's not what it is saying. It's pointing to this thing called safety, a need for safety. And that's the world we find ourselves in as human. In order to be able to communicate to other people, we have our 5 senses, 6 when you include umami. And so we have these senses, and I can communicate to you. I'm limited to how I can communicate with you except through my senses and your senses. And so if I can identify the need, it seems to be a human translator, or that's the way I've talked about it. Like when we were in Pakistan, we really had poor communication. And then I've just recently read a book called The Culture Code, which talks very much about the nonverbal part of communication. And the author there puts forward the idea that even more communication takes place about safety and predictability and order and so on through the nonverbal communication. That if you want to create collaboration, if you want to bring people together who are in conflict, that you need to be cognizant of and be paying attention to the nonverbal communication, to the micro movements, the facial expressions, the tone of voice, the urgency or the non-urgency, how loud, how soft, the shoulder droop, everything about your communication. So needs are a way that just in ways that I do not have any kind of scientific story to try to explain them. It's like when I can guess someone's need, or when I'm with them and I may be guessing and may be missing, but they identify that whether it's offered by me or whether it comes spontaneously within their own thought. With the naming of the need, they often burst into tears. Now, I never had that experience, 20 years of practicing law. All of my adult childhood life, I've never had the experience of people just bursting into tears in front of me. I mean, watching a movie or watching, poetry or some kind of art or some kind of moving tale, yes, but not the saying of a word. And so I believe what we're doing is, again, communicating from that which I have made conscious within myself to the conscious part of another person, which allows access to this nonverbal part. And that nonverbal part is saying yes when the person bursts into tears or softens or is visibly moved. It's like, oh, it's
it's like something like I think I've heard terms like 96 or 98% of what's going on in ourselves is not conscious. I mean, it's not at this conscious word level. So there's this constant, and that's what I would say empathy is why I'm so interested in empathy, is that we're constantly reading each other. I don't even have to talk with someone. I can just tell by their body motion, movement, the vibration that they, you know, of how they're walking or moving, to sort of read what it is that's going on inside of with their experience.
That's what I was talking about. Yeah.
And even when you drink the water, right? You picked up the water and drank it. I can sort of feel the water going down my own, you know, I can feel the motions. And there's all kinds of, you know, neuroscience about that with, you know, mirror neurons, where, you know, where when we see an action and do an action, so the same neurons fire, and we can really sense. So it's really getting into the quality of the sense, the felt experience of life, and becoming more attuned and aware of that. And I think that's the part that you know, trying to translate needs. I mean, it's a big part of like nonviolent communication, you know, needs language, but that those needs are actually feelings that we're sort of desiring. So if I'm looking at like a sense of fairness, that there's the word fairness, but there's a visceral quality of fairness. You know, you can feel, you don't know what fairness is unless you can feel that quality of fairness. We feel the sense of safety. We feel the sense of not being safe. You know, with the tension, you know, the constriction in our body. You know, we feel that we can feel the anxiety, the nervousness, the tension of the, you know, from that danger. So we sort of sense and then we sense this sort of calmness of feeling of you know, safety. For example, you know, we have the empathy tent that we take out to these political left-right conflicts. So conservatives come to Berkeley, you know, to march and for their free speech. And then the political left comes out, Antifa comes out, and, you know, they go into street fights, you know, knock down street fights. And the first time I set up the empathy tent in Berkeley at one of these, I went over to the conservative side, and I was nervous. I was like feeling anxious. You know, it's like, who are these people? They're all like pretty burly, you know, kind of guys. They're all decked out with helmets and, you know, protective gear because, you know, they're prepared for a street fight. And so I was kind of nervous, you know, going and talking to them. So I went over, but I did go, and I started dialoguing with them. We have a little container called with empathy kisses. So these are Hershey's, you know, chocolate kisses, and it says empathy kisses. And I offer them to people, you know, to the guys that were there, and started talking with them and invite them over to the empathy tent. And over time, just through this dialoguing, having them, you know, being in dialogue with them, starting to see they're pretty open to dialogue. They're willing to listen. You know, we're able to, you know, dialogue back and forth. And slowly that I felt the sense of safety, you know, and, you know, started feeling quite comfortable. But it was all the visceral. When I went there first, it was like, you know, really, you know, quite tense, and a lot of people won't go and talk with them because they have that fear, and they're sort of not really addressing the fear and overcoming it through dialogue. So anyway, the need there was for safety and for connection, in that sense, that feeling of connection, and that so that was, so it is, I guess, that the part I'm trying to get at with that I've been kind of thinking about and trying to kind of, you know, bounce this off you, is that these needs are felt experiences that we live,
talk about them that way,
that there is this world of felt experience that is sort of kind of ignored to a large extent, the importance and the sensitivity to felt experience and how it's so central to our lives.
Well, first off, I think you're responding to people that sometimes talk about NVC as being a very heady process, and that's not my experience of it, because I've explained my experience, and I think what you're describing is a visceral experience. Let me put into my words what I'm hearing you're talking about, and see if this is the same thing. So once you wanted to go over there, what arose in you was this sense of anxiety or discomfort, or maybe even bordering on fear. And that changed the way you held your body. Can't help but have changed the way you held your body. And you identified the need is for safety. Okay. Now, then and with that need being safety, and with these processes that, for instance, in this newest book, Collaborating in the Workplace, that we call Preparing for a Difficult Conversation, you can accelerate that process that you described that took place with those protesters, and accelerate it so that you, at least in starting across, that your body language would be in with that sense of safety being met, not in some kind of way in which you think you're safe just because you dream yourself to be safe. You can still be alert, but you can still be present and not be manifesting the physical anxiety in the same way. So then you go, and then you've already gotten, so to speak, a head start on de-escalating the situation. So that's what I heard you describe. And the model that I hear you trying to say is something like, the need is experienced as a physiological experience. The need is experienced as a felt sense.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
And so it's a way of saying, yes, I feel fear, and I want to have the felt sense of safety.
Yeah. And actually connection too, if I think about it now. I'm wanting those two, safety and connection.
And I'm wanting the felt sense of those. Well, that would totally work for me as languaging, because I'm making this distinction between what is naming what is present in me. What is present in me is whatever the physiological experience is in the moment. And that you described is a kind of I forget. Anyway, fear.
Yeah, it's anxiety, stress, constriction of my body, kind of a rigidity in myself.
Yeah, and then there are also thoughts probably about, if I would have been in your place, I'd have had thoughts about them and judgments about them.
Exactly,
and,
yeah.
Criticism of their view of the world, and they're wrong and I'm right. And that's the way I start out. But, I have not been able to short circuit this process of having judgments. I have the judgments, and then I try to identify them as soon as possible, and then I try to transform them into, well, what is this about? This is, in my language, this is a part of me that's trying to help me when it has these judgments.
Yeah.
And it's been very helpful for millennia, for hundreds of thousands of years. We don't know how far back we've had this capacity to think this way.
So you're not wanting to judge the judgments, in a sense.
Yeah, I'm not judging the judgments. It's been helpful, been useful. It's just, I believe that this process that NVC lends itself to being used for, or that it points at, is a process that is better, more effective, more effective in the sense that it better meets my needs and meets the needs of people around me. And in meeting their needs, again, it's meeting my needs, because I really can't be fully satisfied that my needs are met when there are others whose needs are not met. And that's why it's sometimes very painful to be in this world of ours in which there are so many people treating each other so badly.
Yeah, so for me, I'm looking, I call it a culture of empathy. It's like, how do we build a culture where there is this valuing of I call it empathy, because I see empathy as sort of this integrative process. It's like you're talking about the self-connection, that when I sense into myself and feel the anxiety or the fear, that is sort of that's the empathic process. Instead of becoming aware of it, is the empathic process, and then going into it and following what's underneath there, what's underneath the fear, what's underneath the anxiety, and kind of being present with it instead of trying to shut it down and kind of sort of open it up and see what's sort of behind those feelings.
Yeah, I like all of what you said, but I wouldn't want to stop there.
Yeah.
I didn't want to say, what can I do to better meet these needs for myself or others?
So having that action component of how to actually create that sometimes it's struggling, like the vocabulary. What are the words for all these different experiences? But how to address. So for creating that sense of connection, like how do I create that sense of connection with the people in that environment? For me, it was reaching out and dialoguing. So it's just having an empathic dialogue, listening to them, being willing to hear what's going on. What's going on for you? Tell me. I'm here to listen, and I'm just, I'm not here to argue. I'm just wanting to hear what you have to say, and so that's how I sort of met that, created that quality of connection, and it actually, it's actually created a real sense of warmth with people. I actually feel quite a sense of connection and warmth now for them. It feels really good.
Yeah. So I really like that, and I like this idea that, like, you took that action, and then you met certain needs that you describing as generating feelings of warmth and a sense of satisfying needs for connection, and then what is so the NVC is this process for me of shaping my life, of choosing as much as possible, moment by moment, what is it that I want to do to make a more satisfying, to thrive in this life, to make a more satisfying and fulfilled life. So that would be kind of a koan or a question that I would float to myself, not analytically try to figure out, but okay, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and I've just gone across and I've communicated with these people, and I've felt this physiological shift in myself. And now, I'm a new Edwin in that moment. Now, what are my feelings and needs, and what is my request?
So be sensitive.
Request of myself and request of others. In this moment, the next moment, what am I feeling? What am I needing? And what am I requesting of myself or others?
Yeah, for what comes up for me is really expand to create, to expand that quality and that feeling.
Yeah.
So
it sounds like that's what your work is. Your work is to be a Johnny Appleseed of this experience for people.
Yeah, that is. It's like how to really, in fact, that's sort of what this interview is about too. On one hand, it's like, you're someone that's been working in this area, you have a lot of experience, and it's like, how do we spread this? How do we spread, I guess for effectiveness, it's like, that's something, a feeling, there's a quality of it, a forward motion, a sense of things happening, of sort of these qualities, these feelings sort of spreading, because it seems like the opposite is sort of happening in the society, that there's so much polarization, so much conflict, so much just disconnection, and people sort of pulling into themselves and really in pain. There's just a sense of people, there's this lack of connection and a lot of pain, and it seems like we're sort of awash. The culture is awash in it.
Yeah. That's my experience of others, but also my internal experience.
Yeah.
So let me try to answer your question this way, which is starting out with what I have found that doesn't work. Is talking about this experience. I can talk about it with you, and I imagine that people who watch this who've had some experience of what we're talking about, they can then connect the language we're using with their experience, their felt experience, and this model of observations, feelings, needs, and requests. This idea of self-empathy. Then silent empathy for the other person, and then self-expression, and out loud empathy for the other person, empathizing with the other person. But if a person doesn't have this experience, I've found it very challenging to try to convey this to them, to decision makers and people at all levels and strata in society. It's just like they just haven't had the experience of it. So the language doesn't point to anything for them.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have meaning.
There's no visceral experience. It's like you need sort of this visceral felt experience to associate the terms with that,
right.
That experience.
They haven't used this language to point to their life experience. So my strategy when I'm talking with a decision maker is I try to demonstrate the process to them. And then if and when they experience this kind of shift that I've talked about, this physiological change in them, then I can point to that and say, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's one way of conveying this. And so then a corollary to that is just being what you're trying to communicate and convey, and not by standing around talking about observations, feelings, needs, and requests and all this stuff, but getting so fluent in using those as the way you parse your experience in the world that then you can use the language which is consistent with the person you're with, but is also consistent with your values. And so then they just experience you as this person who, Edwin Rutsch, walking up to the protesters. They experience that over and over again, and then they become curious and interested and so on. So that's a corollary to the first one. The other way, which I have tried to get for 20 years and have been unsuccessful, is good video that demonstrates this physiological shift and the process that led up to it. So now I'm offering to people, if they're willing to have a dispute or their personal empathy process videoed on a Zoom call like this, I will do that work without any charge. If they will agree that I can use it, put it on the internet, and I can use it to then have, because I believe that people can see the physiological shifts that take place because we're so used to interpreting those. We do those without conscious thought. And so then it's another way of people go, oh, I've experienced that before. That's happened to me before. Oh, that's what this guy is talking about. Oh, I'm now interested. I want to know more about this. So I think it's crucial to get really high quality video of ever more complex and difficult conflicts, yes, but more I talk of conflicts as disconnection. See, I see NVC as a strategy for connection. And it's a strategy, it's not the be all and the end all. There are other strategies that I started this call with of how you can create connection. But my goal is connection, because it's with connection that I can then build trust with someone, and then I can collaborate with them we can decide what we want to collaborate towards, and then collaborate towards it. Collaborating in the deciding and collaborating in the execution.
Well, I have an anecdote for that. So my family, I live in the Bay Area. My family's in Sacramento, near Sacramento in the Central Valley, Marysville. And so they're conservative, evangelical, fundamentalists, so rather different from myself. And I've been talking about empathy with them. And they just saw it as like we don't know what you mean. It's like, it has kind of like no meaning to them. Like, it's just,
I have had this experience. Yeah.
Okay. You've had the experience. So it was about 4 or 5 years ago, a conflict happened in the family, and it was like Christmas. You know, my sister-in-law got really pissed off with my mother, and my mother was just not going to take it, you know. So they just went at it with each other. And I started just doing empathic listening or reflective listening to my in the middle of this. And everybody else was like, you know, heading for the corners, trying to get out of the room, you know, get away from this. And I was just listening to, you know, the sister-in-law doing empathic listening, you know, until she felt heard. Then I would speak, you know, in real time with my mother, Jenny, do the same thing. And it just went back and forth for like 15 minutes. But slowly they started feeling, you know, a bit heard and calming down a little bit, you know, enough to where then I asked them to do empathic listening with each other. And they said, okay, we'll try it. And I'll say, you'll get fully heard, just reflect back what you're hearing, you know, to the satisfaction of the speaker, kind of explained it. And I had been modeling it as well. And then they did it, and, you know, they struggled, you know, somebody would say something and the other would say, I did not, I said, just, you'll get your turn, you know. And so I modeled it, and then they started talking to each other, and things started calming down a little bit more. And then the family members started coming into the circle, right? So it turned into this sort of family empathy circle, and we kept it on track. You know, one person would select who to speak to, and they would get reflected, and we just kept going around like that. And then at the end, it kind of turned out the real deeper issue, which was, you know, a sense of needing to feel belonging. You know, my sister-in-law didn't feel like she really belonged in the family and wasn't accepted. And then, you know, my father got up, you know, just had this open-hearted, you know, just, you belong, and, you know, it just value what your contribution to the family and all this, and, you know, hugs in the middle of the room. And it kept going until my sister-in-law and my mother kind of had the same, you know, sense of connection. And then, you know, at the end, they're sitting next to each other, kind of cuddled up, you know, holding, you know, hands with each other, all, you know, really just kind of melted into each other. And then at the end of that, I said, this is empathy. So they had the visceral kind of quality of it. And then from then on, it was almost like a transformation that it became, you know, that the family members were willing to do, you know, family mediations, you know, holding sort of periodic empathy circles. And it sort of became, you know, a quality within the family to the point. It became a norm, yeah. To the point where, you know, my sister and sister-in-law, they had a dispute about this tortoise, like who is responsible for losing this tortoise. And I said, oh, I can help with an empathy circle. And they said, no, we got it covered. We know how to do this. You know, and it was a whole series of these.
Wonderful story.
It's one of the most transformational, because it's very personal, you know, for me. Yeah. But that is exactly, you know, what I hear you say. It's we have to demonstrate it to actually. We can do this sort of, you know, dialoguing about the terms and so forth, and have, you know, build the vocabulary, which, you know, I think is useful, and because it causes a lot of confusion. But it's the visceral felt experience of going through from disconnection to connection that, you know, finding ways of doing that.
I would like to have your story videoed, you know, I mean, but you can't replicate it. In other words, you can't, it doesn't, it's, and most of the time when people are disconnected, they're in pain. And when they're in pain, I've found it very challenging to have them agree to being videoed.
But perhaps there's something we could do together. I see that as central. We put together an event called the Radical Empathy Forum with candidates running for the Assembly 15 district that I'm in. So we had 11 candidates who came together and actually did empathy circles with each other using, you know, active listening, empathic listening. And the topic was how to create a more empathic culture. So it didn't have, we didn't have the knockdown, drag out conflict aspect to it, but, to find a way of bringing that into politics and with maybe even high profile, people that is a way. So I'm just, I don't know, just putting it out there. There might be some way.
Anything you can organize, I'd love to work with you.
Okay.
In whatever role. Sounds like you can do it yourself. You don't need me in that sense to facilitate, but I'm willing to offer my, what my experience and my skills in any way that would help.
Well, it's good to have. We had an incident, for example. We set up, I don't know how you're on with time. We're at a little bit over an hour. I don't want to keep you over, but how much time do you have?
Yeah, I would like to end within a few minutes, but I'm fine. I've got some leeway.
Okay, so we did an empathy circle at these conflicts in Berkeley at the university, at UC Berkeley, and I invited the leader of the right wing into the empathy tent, and he brought his whole entourage. And then we had the left who were like screaming and yelling, trying to shut the whole thing down. We're doing like an empathy circle. So it was like me as the only mediator there trying to hold. We had like maybe 200 people around the tent with the, like maybe almost like 50 or 60 police on the outside. It was just like total chaotic mayhem. So it was like a lot to really hold. And, so it's like having, connections and support and, trying to do this stuff together, I think would be really supportive, just to have the connection, and even that this can even be done online.
We can do online, or I've had the experience of doing mediations with large groups in a big room, and having 3, 4, 5 of us fairly well trained and experienced, and it really helped because one person could step in and sort of go for a while, and then they sort of lost the thread. But and also to keep what you were talking about, tracking of who's speaking and who are they speaking to and who's reflecting, doing all of that. So the point of saying that is that this idea of having yourself and others to be, there's a kind of way that when you're in those situations, I can see what you're doing and where you're headed.
Mm-hmm.
And I can offer support in ways, or I can talk with somebody else, or I can, interact with the police or with some of the protesters on the other side, whatever that is.
Yeah, we needed like somebody to be able to, we had the by any means necessary, which is, moving towards the Antifa side, just screaming and yelling, like no KKK, no fascist USA, no Trump. That's all they would do, just scream. And I'm saying, would you like to take part in an empathy circle? And they just said, no KKK. So they're totally screaming. So we really needed, to be able to have folks to kind of deal with that.
What I would like in order to be part of this is at least to have 2 handheld videographers who have experience shooting in conflict situations. And then you would need to have a sound producer, and you'd need to probably have another overall producer. So you'd at least have a team of at least 4 people. So there's a fair amount of expense, or volunteerism, or so on. I'd be willing to contribute towards the equipment expense, and that could it might produce nothing. That's the risk in these things.
Yeah,
is you video something and it might not have what you're looking for, but it also could have something way beyond.
Well, we have connection with the right-wing leader. One of them is Joey Gibson, and he came after Charlottesville to San Francisco and to Berkeley, and I mean, it was all hell was breaking. I mean, Nancy Pelosi was, condemning him, all this kind of stuff. The first thing I did is I just reached out to him. I said, would you like to do an empathy circle with, someone on the other side? And he said, sure. He was like totally open. And it took me like 2 days to find someone on the left that was, I mean, for some, this is a whole nother topic, is why the left is not willing to dialogue. Right. And then they finally were willing to do it. And we did just a short, half an hour empathic listening process. And I thought it worked, fairly well. And it, had like 5,000 views or so. But it's sort of those type of things, doing it online that.
So you are starting on what I created a model once about how to deal with these intractable conflicts, like in Ireland is what I was thinking about at the time, because I had some connection with people in Ireland. So. But also there have been radio shows in Rwanda that they tried to bring groups together by using melodrama, what do you call melodramas in the afternoon?
Yeah, I think I heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah, soap opera. And my idea is that you create what you just created, and you use that to then go to you sort of are climbing up levels of of influence, of people who have an audience, and you use this video to provide legitimacy for you to go and go to the next, until you can have this conversation among leaders that are swaying many, many, many people, and again it's verbal and what they agree to, yes, but it's also getting to see what their body language is and what their tone of voice and all of that.
Yeah, just last week there was a political event here with Gavin Newsom and Buffy Wicks, who's running for the Assembly District. So I actually talked to Gavin Newsom, and I said, "Do you support a culture of empathy?" And he said, "No, I don't." So he was sort of joking, but I said, "Would you take part in an empathy circle with John Cox, who's the Republican candidate?" And he said, "Well, Cox has no empathy." I said, "Well, would you do an empathy circle with him?" He said, he wouldn't do it. So I said, "Well, I'll check and I'll see if he'll do it, and then I'll get back to you." And then his wife, Jennifer, was there, and she said, "My film is about empathy." And I kind of talked to her a little bit, and it turns out she has a film on the social divisions that are happening in the country, and she's a real fan, it looks like, of Rihanna Eisler. I don't know if you know of her work.
Yes.
And so she was saying the last third of her film, which she's just taking to Sundance, is about empathy. So she addresses it and has people talking about empathy. So that was like a connection. I'm kind of looking at how do we bring these dialogues into the political sphere now? Bring the politicians together and have these empathy circles with them. And it takes some finagling, wheeling, and dealing. And we're going in October to Politicon, which is in Los Angeles, which is a big conference or event, a conference, I guess, with the political left and right. And so, CNN and all these pundits are there, and, politicians, and Ann Coulter and, Ben Shapiro, and, all these people were there. So we're going to be trying to, connect with them and try to line up these, dialogues. This is, if you wanted to be there, that'd be great, because we actually have a paid booth, and we're going to have the empathy tent there. And it's October 20th and 21st in the Los Angeles Convention Center.
Unfortunately, I'm going to be in China facilitating some workshops, unfortunately.
Okay, well,
But you're doing exactly, I'm very excited about what you're doing, and I think this has tremendous potential. I would like you to have more support. Because these are kind of freewheeling, what you described in Berkeley at the empathy circle tent, that's a challenge for however many people who are skilled and capable, much less just one person. So I hand it to you, and maybe you'll get some really good stuff out of out of this thing in Los Angeles. If we were talking about the left and the right, not necessarily the politicians, well, they're all political, but the elected members, I wouldn't so much focus on elected members at first, because they have so much reason not to step across to the other person. They have so much to lose. Whereas if you talk with individuals that are, everybody gets entrenched in their position and they have their reference group. There's a whole thing about their reference group, and it's difficult for them to move away from their reference group, because they've got to, after this, they've got to go out and explain themselves to their reference group. But if you can get these people that, on the left and the right, and you can do what you were saying, is to first have a pre-mediation session with each one, which in itself would make great video. It's you basically do what we call the enemy image process, or in a business context, I call it preparing for a difficult conversation. And you first use the process of empathizing to help them meet their need for empathy. And then when their need for empathy is met, then they become curious about the other side. It often starts out with saying, oh no, that's impossible, the other side's impossible, they're a bunch of jerks or a bunch of whatever. And then you begin to deconstruct their judgments into observations, feelings, needs, and requests. So you do silent empathy for the other person, but you do it out loud with the person you're working with. And then often you have some discussion about what did they learn from this process, and then what plan might they have, and do they want to do any further practice before they actually have this conversation with this other person. And then you do that with the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And then you bring them together, and or they agree to come together. It's not you're not in charge, you're not in control. It's a series of requests, and asking if they'd be willing to come together. And if they agree, then you video that, and now you have a package of an integrated process.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you were like in Nirvana land, then several days later, a week or more, you could then have a debrief with each of the people and video the debrief. And really, then you can point back at the video and say, what did that mean to you? And then you're, again, going in, deepening the needs, trying to find out how this may have transformed from them. And I call that learning. It's a word that's usable in the general public, but that process of debriefing, what Marshall called mourning and celebrating, John Kenyon and I call the Mourn, Celebrate, Learn process, which we've written about in a number of places, help them reflect upon what they've learned.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Integrate it.
Package, integrate it and articulate it, and that what they did is not just a one-off. And then that would make this. Then you edit the whole thing, because you can't just now you've got minimum you've got whatever 4 or 5 hours of video, probably more like 8 or 10, and so you've got to edit it down. But I think that you could edit it honestly and faithfully, and you'd have I think a really powerful package.
Well, I'm really excited about this, because that's the vision, exactly what you're laying out, and it sounds like you're having, you're on that path, and the more we can connect with others and collaborate and work on this, because it's hard work. It's like being in the middle of these conflicts, and it's like, and there's not a lot of support, and it's pretty heavy duty and stressful. So the more community we have around this, I feel that's like, I just feel really excited about this connection, and having been able to talk to you here and find find those situations, because that's exactly those pre empathy circles. And for example, there was I don't know if you heard of James Damore. He was fired from Google for writing the Google Memo.
Yes. Yeah.
So I actually did 2 pre-circles with him where we just sat and talked, did empathic listening, and, we recorded it on Zoom here. And he was like, we had a great connection, really good. And then I was looking for people like the feminists on the other side that would be willing to dialogue with him. And it was just so much work trying to find someone that would talk with him. They were saying, no, I don't want to give him any attention. I don't want to give him a platform. So,
right.
So it's actually, so that was the kind of, the sort of the next step. And it would have been great, to have others that, could reach out, do those pre-circles, so, and then help facilitate or co-facilitate.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, okay, well, I guess I'll stop the call here. I don't want to keep you, I can go forever on this stuff because I'm so excited about it.
So
but
let's set up another call.
Okay.
I'm leaving October 8th, so let's do it before then.
Okay.